Database DevOps with Matt Gordon.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies that are building mission-critical software systems. We are in the full second year of my software architect forums. You can sign up for the next session, and the link will be in the show notes. And if you lead a software team and you're looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, then go ahead and sign up. And this year, we've added a peer forum called the Software Leadership Forum for managers and executives that are overseeing custom software teams. So two opportunities. If you want the more technical track, that's the Architect Forum. If you want the more management track, then that's the Leadership Forum. But you can go to clearmeasure.com/forums to find both of those. And of course, if you're looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, you can just search for it in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Matt Gordon. Matt is a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and has worked with SQL Server since the year 2000. He's the leader of the Lexington, Kentucky Data Technology Group and a frequent domestic and international community speaker. He's an IDERA ACE alumnus and Redgate Community Ambassador. His original data professional role was in database development, which quickly evolved into query tuning work that further evolved into being a DBA in a healthcare arena. And he's supported several critical systems using SQL Server and managed dozens of live site SQL Server implementations. And as a Microsoft lead data architect at Centric Consulting, he works with customers large, medium, small to migrate to the cloud, make their data estate operate efficiently, and to find the right tools and solutions within the Microsoft Data Platform. Matt, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I am good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. You and I had the pleasure last week of being in a panel discussion at a Redgate Summit in New York City, and that was fun. And I knew I had to have you on the show because of just the conversation. So I'm so glad that you're here. So glad that you're here.
Yeah, no, it was a great week last week, and yeah, it's fun to kind of keep that going because I feel like that panel we could have run well past the scheduled time.
Right. Well, there's people listening to the show that have heard you speak before, but there's people that haven't. So I want to kind of back up a little bit. And besides the items in your bio, just kind of backtracking your career. You've been in the custom software and database world for a long time, but kind of back up. What are the highlights or turning points that you think are responsible for steering you to being, one of the top luminaries on the Microsoft database side in our industry?
I don't know about that, but I am going to point that out to my wife. It's very nice. Honestly, and I have a talk that I give about this. When I made the move to consulting, basically 9-ish years ago, I was very fortunate to get plugged in with a team and with a manager who believed in me. And I've blogged about this and stuff. I had a stutter when I was a kid, and honestly still do sometimes. And public speaking always terrified me. But a part of the first consulting role I had, it was you had to go out and speak 4 times a year. That's just what that role had to do. And I was really open and said, I don't really want to do that, but I can do the work. I just don't want to go do that part. And very supportive boss who's awesome. And I I went and did my first talk. Every demo broke. I was terrified. I can't believe I did not rip the podium in half from gripping the sides and doing all the things the Toastmasters say not to. I drove home and my wife's like, how'd it go? I said, well, I'm never doing that again. And that turned out to be untrue. So it's fun teaching people, and the thing you learn is that the audience is rooting for you. If you stumble over a word, if a demo burns up, whatever, odds are you've probably still taught somebody something they didn't know. And once that was kind of pointed out to me, it almost started getting fun, and now I really do enjoy it. It's opened so many doors. I wouldn't be on here. Yeah, it's just very supportive community where you go to work is so important. It's honestly changed my life.
Awesome. Before we kind of dive into just changing and operating databases, you've been working with SQL Server since 2000. What are some of the high points that maybe have kind of been consistent since that older version 24 years ago, and what things are radically different that come to mind?
It's an interesting one. One of the nice things about SQL Server, and you could extend this to Azure SQL, is largely a consistent querying and development experience. So as the platform has changed and improved, as it's extended to the cloud and all that, now there's a couple spots in there where this wasn't true, but largely, as you make those jumps with it, it's not a sea change. You're not having to learn this massive amount of new things. So if you've been a long time SQL Server shop, you've been able to expand your footprint into the cloud and upgrade to new versions, and without a lot of disruption. And I'm glossing over a lot. We could have an 8-hour podcast on changes between versions and all that, but nobody would listen. So we're not going to do that. But that's one thing that's been nice as Azure's matured and you've seen analytics and everything grow up around this. That core SQL experience, is pretty familiar still. Management Studio even, kind of looks like it has for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to raise up, and you've done a lot of work in this, raise up just the concept of DevOps for databases and the two parts of how to seamlessly make changes without everybody stepping over each other and making mistakes. And then after that, you talk about how to monitor and operate databases in production, which, the two sides of DevOps, development operations, is change and keep it running well. And then how to figure out what to do so that those things are actually integrated instead of separated. And we talked about at the Redgate Summit, Flyaway, that, there's been several iterations of products for change management, but you do a lot of consulting. What besides products and tools that can be put into the mix, how should people be thinking about the process for making changes? What does that environment look like on people's workstations, and what's the general process that you advise people to use in today's day and age?
It's tough because I'd almost abstract it away from that, because where you see, you can get, a lot of times it's not difficult, or it's not too difficult to get the core team bought in. Like the database devs, DAs, all the people that would be involved in kind of the change management on the database side don't want to break things, especially the DBAs, because generally it's their phone that's going to ring, or their Slack or Teams that's going to go off when something goes down. So they want to make sure the change is carefully managed. So if you come in and say, we're adopting this set of tools, we're adopting this process, whatever, that's typically not a difficult sell. As long as it's the right tool and as long as the process isn't overly cumbersome and all that. Where I see the issue come in a lot is teams bought in, team leads bought in, and you go up the org chart, and the impression, for better or worse, arguably not true, is that database changes are easy to make. So something happens, there's a performance issue, slap an index on it, change to this, do that. And then that executive manager, whatever, I don't want to call out a specific, but somebody higher on the food chain than the folks doing the work will say, oh, this is critical, customer XYZ is slow, is down, is unhappy, is going to fire us, whatever, make the change now. And if your environment is not properly secured, or even if it is, the word comes down from on high, okay, implement this line of code, create this index, whatever, and handle the issue. And it's at that point the process breaks for a long time, because once you do it once, then everybody's like, well, we did it last time, and so it's probably okay. And and then nobody follows the process after a while. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, I'd really almost take it away, from tool sets and processes, because the people executing those never want to break it. It's the outside pressures. So it's such a, you hear almost every like DevOps person talk about it. Like, oh, it's process, it's culture. You have to think that way. And all those things are true, but you need the support to do that. You can have everybody that touches a keyboard in that entire process bought in. And the second they're asked to intervene in that and change it just this once, um, derails the whole thing.
Okay. So stick to the process and don't make exceptions.
Yeah, I mean that. Obviously, I'm a practical person.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a client that's spending $50 million a month on your platform, call in and say our experience is terrible and we're going to fire you. Like, I understand the practical part of that decision, but where it starts to erode is it's not that size customer. It's not that, oh, this is an anchor account. If we lose them, the company is going to struggle. It's, I just got an angry phone call from a customer, not to minimize those, but you better support all your customers following these processes, because in the end, I've seen a lot more stuff broken by that kind of a change than actually fixed. Or
Mm-hmm.
you've fixed the one thing, and then a day or two down the road you realize the other issue you caused, because in the heat of the moment you didn't, it wasn't well tested, if at all, and you didn't kind of think through every eventuality. It's hard. Somebody's yelling at you to get things done.
Right. Well, outside those putting out a fire situations, when things are more normal and you just say, oh, you know what? Oh yeah, we need to add that table, or we need to, lengthen a column. What's the type of process you typically advise?
I'll be honest, it's rare that I come into a place where the development process, where they're completely green.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, ask us what, or tell us what we should do. It's more, is what we're doing okay? So there's some core parts of that. You want the requirements you're developing to be clear. So maybe it is just that simple. Our account name needs to be a longer field because we now support account names in a different language or something like that, and it has to be longer. So if you're developing to that clear rec, that's one thing. I'm a big fan of peer review, whatever format that might take. It's rare that we're working shoulder to shoulder these days. You're a lot more likely to be using VS Code or Azure Data Studio or something like that. One of these lightweight tools, some of those offer the ability to kind of peer review on the fly and kind of live share that. VS Code does. I think that's a critical part of the process. Just thinking back to my time on the development side of the house, peer review is always an important part of turning out quality software. I certainly, especially in this day and age, I understand the perspective of manager types that are saying, well, we could use AI to do that. And sure, there is a time, there will be more of a time where those tools can supplement things like that. They find the missing semicolon, they find the misspelled word or something like that. But reviewing what's been done, somebody in a position to know reviewing that, I think, is important. And then it's utilizing your tool of choice to properly check that in. All this stuff should be in source control, and and then we could debate like what's the proper frequency of deployments and builds and all that. But for me, it comes down to that basic X and O stuff really early on. From there, I wouldn't say there's no wrong way to do it, but any of the kind of well-known tools I think are fine.
Mm-hmm.
I like Redgate stuff, but they're not the only game in town.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Redgate. Flyway is kind of the newer product where SQL change automation was, a product they had for a long time. Do you have kind of a mix of that older product versus Flyway, or have you, largely shifted? What's, because I know that is changed a bit in the portfolio within Redgate. So how should people think about that mix?
For me, I've been using Redgate tools a long time, long before they had any idea who I was and I was appearing at events or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I've used that for a long time. So it kind of depends. I think on where the processes grow out of. If they've grown out of a long time kind of data team, they probably used Redgate something. This could be SQL Compare, it could be Prompt, it could be who knows what. They're, I think, more likely to have like the SQL change automation, and I would say some of the more traditional tools. A shop that is where the DevOps has grown out of the development side of the house is way more likely to look into Flyway or something like that, because they're probably already familiar. They might be already familiar with that tool, from some of their other dealings over the years. But yeah, I think those data-driven shops, I don't see a lot of Flyways at those. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but they just are a little later to the party because it's not what they've known Redgate for. Where I can think of customers this year that were developing on other data platforms, and Flyway was very interesting to them. They were not familiar with Redgate outside of that, but they say, hey, we're kind of struggling for a tool to do this. Have you heard of this? Well, I've heard of Flyway, but I haven't heard of Redgate, and they get into it. But yeah, you tell them about SQL Compare, anything like that, they have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, you've been focused on the database for your whole career, and for me, it hasn't been the sole focus. It's just been part of the equation for my career. But
yeah.
I think anyone that's been doing it for long enough has had a situation where there was a surprise where it works fine locally, it works fine in a test environment. Then you run it with the amount of data that you actually have to run it, much larger database and certain tables and certain one-to-many relationships. And now, okay, this flat out doesn't work, or this query takes way too long, or the CPU is way out of control. And so, for a lot of listeners that are younger in the career, I want to ask more of the fundamental question. In 2024, how should we be monitoring our databases so that we get early signals that either it's behaving really well, or, ooh, okay, I need to jump in here and not just wait for a user complaint because of a slow screen?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Yeah, I end up talking about this a lot because, even though I'm more broadly data focused and have done AI speaking since before it was cool, so since like 2018, it does often come back to the health of the data and where the data lives. And having done a lot of those kind of talks over the years, it's a tough question to answer. Like in a perfect world, we should have robust monitoring across our entire estate. We should have tools that give us the ability to see change, see trends, drill into those, understand, hey, this might be what's causing the trend, or put some information at our fingertips about locking, blocking, who knows what, that may be causing the issue. That's an imperfect world. The reality is, and I've worked in shops like this, I've certainly consulted at shops like this. I won't say often, but many times are tasked with an environment that's critical to the health of the business, and you don't have a comparable test environment or dev or anything like that because there's no budget for it. It's in the sessions that I give around that, I take a pretty hard line on it. If you're in an environment like that, and I have been, where it's like, listen, the business, if this platform is not healthy, does not perform well, the business suffers, and like it's all on you, basically. and you say, I need this environment. So when you come and ask me, how long will this failover take? How long will this deployment of a change take? Within reason, I can answer that. And the response is, we don't have any money for that. If you can afford the enterprise edition licenses, especially on-prem or business critical in the cloud or something like that, you need to create a budget for this. If you don't, then the business is not really taking your role seriously. And like I said, I take a pretty hard line. I advise people to start looking. That's a situation in my experience that rarely improves, because they're taking you and your talents for granted, and they're assuming a lot of the technology, and it isn't magic. Like, you need people and you need things to make it go. So get your hands on the best monitoring tool you can. I've been in the position where I had to roll my own, and I was able to handle some issues that way, but it's very difficult to write your own tool that does an amazing job of giving you all the data you need at your fingertips when an incident happens, or better yet, when one's going to happen in 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to write something for yourself that intercepts all those, where a lot of the third-party tools do, and while they're not cheap, like I said, when you're talking these environments that may cost 6 to 7 figures to beyond to run, a few $1,000s for a good monitoring tool is reasonable.
If budget is not an issue, do you have a couple favorites?
I don't want to pick favorites. I'll be candid here. Hopefully that's okay.
Yeah, please.
I was a big fan of Century One, and I know I wasn't the only one that was. For me, it was best of breed for a long time. I had a long-term customer that they had Century One, and then we were part of the rollover. So when SolarWinds acquired them, there wasn't really any instant impact to the tool.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it seems like the pace of development in that tool since the acquisition has slowed down. The support experience degraded a little for us either. It's still very good. But in terms of is it the long-term focus of SolarWinds, or is that DPA? I don't know. And I'm not saying anything bad about any of that. Obviously every company has calls to make on, what their top flight is and what it isn't.
Right.
DPA is fine. It's very lightweight. It's never been top of my list. What SQL Monitor gives you right now, I'm a big fan of. And we actually talked about this last week. I go to a lot of shops where a decision's made several rungs above the data team. It's like, we need enterprise monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go for one of those enterprise monitoring tools. It'll monitor everything, app servers, web servers, data, all this stuff. That rarely gives the data people what they need. And so that's where something like a SQL Monitor or SQL Sentry or something like that, it's absolutely essential, because from those quote enterprise monitoring tools in the data layer, oftentimes what they go down to is not much more than the database is slow, there's some locking. And the things that those of us that have kind of run in that world for a long time are used to being able to drill down into either don't exist, or they don't exist intuitively there. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the dedicated tools.
Okay. On my front, even at the simplest form for developer workstations, I'm also a fan of Entity Framework Profiler, just to select the N+1 problems, and just to show where you have an unbounded one-to-many query, where that if 10 records in a child collection is perfectly fine, but you get into a situation where you have thousands or a million child records in production over time, predictably that query is going to give you problems at some point.
I would say I've seen a lot of scenarios, right, where that kind of profiling work is not being done. And for the data audience that may be joining me here, Entity Framework for them could be a 4-letter word.
Yeah.
You might have to bleep it, because listen, I understand why those tools exist. I'm an old enough data head where it does make me shudder a little bit when I hear it. But to your point, there are performance kind of optimization tools there that, at least in my experience, of course, I'm never going anywhere where things are working amazing. Mm-hmm. They're not like, we just want to pay a consultant to tell us we're awesome. That never happens. I'm always there to fix something. But yeah, you walk into an environment and they've done they've done none of that.
Sure.
It's like, well, we put this together with an ORM, and now our database is slow. Like, well, okay, let's have a look at that. I have a pretty good idea why that is. So the more evangelization of, hey, if you're using something like Entity Framework, here's how you can do some optimization steps before your data people yell at you. I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah. Well, I think it can be easy to blame the tools, but I remember inside it was it was around the SQL Server 2000 timeframe, inside a Fortune 100 company that I was working, that it was mandated that every query be inside a stored procedure, but at the same time, we had the same issues. And it's all about the talent and experience and skills to know what that query should be generally, even before you start profiling, what it generally should be and what it generally should not be, because there's predictable problems. And I saw so many problems inside store procedures. And then, yes, if you use Entity Framework and you literally never look at the query that is generating, okay,
right,
you're going to have some problems there too. So, but I just think it's easy to blame, oh, you used the wrong library, you used the wrong tool, versus you really didn't look at the query critically.
That's fair. And to be honest, some devs are at a stage in their career where they don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm always a big fan of, even though I've certainly given devs a lot of grief over the years, like I am not as good at what they do as they are. And so the more we all communicate and make fun of each other a little less, we don't have to stop. But that all helps, because devs, good devs nowadays, I think, need to understand kind of the core principles of databases and how they work. It makes you a better dev, and vice versa. I think it's helpful for data people to understand a little bit what the patterns look like on that side of the fence. But sometimes they're just bad tools. My favorite story about this early on, this is probably 18 years ago. And the company I was at the time, I was a fairly new DBA to them. They really hadn't had SQL Server before. We were just getting started with that. Their Oracle environment wasn't mature. And the technology people, it was a small family-owned firm. Great people, but it wasn't always the best technologists that were making decisions in terms of tools and stuff. And we had a meeting where they showed us what the new development tool was going to be for one of the projects that they had. And they had the gentleman on the phone who was the sales rep and also the lead developer. So first slight red flag there. And so he shows this demo about how you quickly make the screen, and you're making all these buttons and grids and all that. And so I innocently asked, I said, how are you filtering the data that comes back? So if you point it at a table and the table's got 50 million rows, how are you paginating that, filtering it, all that? And he said, we don't do that initially. We do that later in the development cycle. So, okay, well, how do you suppress, like I said, let's say it's a billion rows. You can't bring all that in.
Right.
The tool's going to struggle with that. And he said, we don't do it at that point. We use the star feature, which anybody who's written a query before will know, to get all the things you say select star from. And so since then, I like to refer to select star as the star feature.
The star feature.
And that tool was the wrong tool. We did actually use it in a trial basis there, because like I said, the guys in charge were fans of the guy, but it ultimately did not go forward because, unsurprisingly, the star feature doesn't perform very well.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the rules of thumb. It's never have an unbounded result set. You always need some type of. Maybe you never think it's going to be select top 1 billion, but what happens if it is?
Yeah. So that is one of those things. Like, if I always advocate for the data people to be nosy. In environments where they can be, if there's a new ORM or something like that, or a new tool that's going to impact the ecosystem that you're in charge of, try to elbow into those meetings in a nice way, because, at least at that particular company, and that's kind of an extreme case, I was the only data person.
Yeah.
At that point, really, that was engaging with developers. Had I not asked that question, not that I'm a genius, but it's just how far down that road would we have gone and had some massive issues and promised things to clients that we then couldn't deliver because of the performance of the tool. So, if anything's data adjacent, don't be afraid to offer respectful but candid opinions,
Sure.
and hopefully they're heard.
Right. Well, we're coming off of maybe it's 10 years now of I'll call it the microservices fad, because it certainly there was a huge microservices movement that I think we can safely say that the microservices movement is over, where you have people saying, "Oh, we need to run as fast as we can towards microservices." There's been enough public mistakes and backtracks where we say, "Oh, okay, hold on. Let's not swing all the way in that direction. Maybe we segment a little more than we used to, but we don't need to segment to the nth degree." How do you think about that when you have large databases, and how do you think about possible segmentations of what would otherwise be just really large single databases?
It's an interesting discussion point. So, one of the things you get with the newer architectures, let's call them, we don't need to get too deep into the nerdy stuff, but let's call them the like cloud data warehouses.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an arguable point, and I understand we'd have advanced users who, when they hear what I'm about to say, they're like, "It's not true. You can do that, or it doesn't do that, or whatever." All points well taken, but for the cloud data warehouses, they're kind of doing battle right now. The stuff within Fabric, Databricks, Snowflake, things like that. For the data people, that argument is largely to the side. And again, big shaker of salt that I understand there are cases where that's not true, but this isn't that kind of a podcast. We don't necessarily need to worry about how the data is partitioned and sharded and things like that, because those platforms are taking care of a lot of that for us.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the whole microservices thing, the thing I always come back to, because you and I have been around long enough, you see different hype curves and trends, and there's usually a kernel of quality to all of those. Like there are use cases for all of them. Anytime somebody in tech says this is absolutely what you should do or the thing you should do, that always gives me pause.
Mm-hmm.
Because they, and I'm going to paint with a broad brush here, they probably haven't analyzed your environment or maybe even listened to what you had to say. So if you've gone to somebody, especially asking for help, and they're like, "Never do that." Now, listen, there are things in the SQL Server world, like maintenance-wise, query-wise, where I'd argue never do that is fair. But it's a small list. Even the things that are ugly that we'll make fun of, like, "Oh, when you're writing a query, you should never do this." Sometimes they're a necessary evil. So I always try to keep an open mind. There's a lot of things that I feel strongly about, but and we're seeing it with AI now too. "Oh, you should be doing this. You should absolutely not do that. You should use this framework." I always try to take a step back and listen to what people are really saying, and as a consultant, listen to what people really want. It's not always what they say. So,
Mm-hmm.
I was taught a long time ago, you kind of listen between the lines of what people are saying, and you're going to get to an architecture that generally fits what customer, the client, prospect, whatever needs. But it rarely when you walk in kind of spewing dogma, do you get to that point. You've got to start from listening.
Yeah. As you were making that point, it made me think the never do this advice or anything goes scenarios. If you have a small database, like if you have a holding database or a temporary database that is only, I don't know, 50 megabytes or something like that, in those really small cases, which they're everywhere. I mean, there's tons of small databases for very targeted use cases.
Oh, sure.
In those cases, you almost can't go wrong. It's really hard to have really bad things happening performance wise, or you have so much more flexibility because it's a small database. But then you have people who only work in terabyte databases. Their set of what they know works. They won't touch a whole lot of things with a 10-foot pole. And so if they're talking to somebody who's, slinging 50 megabyte databases, it's a whole different context of fear. Right.
Well, and the way I kind of look at it, since I know you and I have done a little racing, whether it's 2 wheels or 4, racing has different disciplines, whether it's bikes, whether it's cars. And a lot of the core principles are the same. There's 4 tires or there's 2. There's things you do to properly engineer the car or bike to grip the racetrack and all that. But in the different disciplines, there's a lot of different things that you do, and they don't carry over. So I kind of look at databases the same way, like the core principles, like ACID, things like that. That, that doesn't change across a lot of things. But depending on what you're supporting, is it on-prem, is it cloud, like that? For me, I kind of look at it in that same way because my brain always thinks about things in terms of racing. Is, okay, well, we're racing a car, but it's a stock car, or it's an Indy car, or it's a sports car. And that kind of changes what we do and how we set it up and what the right things to do are. And I think where you can get into trouble is when you get an architect or something from a discipline that's not the one that you've brought them for, and they say, well, over here, we always do this, so you should do that here. That's generally the environments I go into that are in pretty rough shape. That's what happened.
Yes.
It was somebody who didn't listen, and they said, well, I do this over here all the time, and you have to do it here. And it wasn't the right fit.
Yeah. And just recently, I was helping a team with a desktop tool that had a data set coming in. And I think at most it would have been, 500 megabytes of a data set.
Yeah.
And they were, running on pretty beefy computers. And I said, 500 megabytes, how much RAM do you typically have? You could just read in, because there's some complicated, you could just read it into RAM. And now,
you have enough.
So when you think about at the smaller end, you have a lot more options, than you do when you have massive data sets. Everything becomes easier. But
I've always thought that was interesting, especially kind of the SQL Server journey through the years. When I had an opportunity at a SQL Saturday or Past Summit or large event, even before it was me, hearing the people that worked on very large databases in prod was always instructive. Because, maybe you didn't do those things in your shop and maybe you didn't need to. But hearing the way smart people thought through the problems at that scale and solved them and all that, I just always thought that was good knowledge to carry around. Maybe you never touched a database that was more than a terabyte. That's fine.
Yeah.
Maybe it was much smaller than that, but I always learned something from those talks because they were dealing with edge cases and problems that I hadn't seen, but it could inform the way you troubleshoot your own environment.
Yeah. It makes me think of some people that the whole world is laying down asphalt to make just a regular country road versus the type of engineering you have to do for interstate highways and the density of the concrete to actually stand up to the weight that is constantly going to be going over interstate highways. It's a totally different discipline.
There's a big difference between me going to Lowe's to buy something to patch something in my driveway that I hit with a shovel or something like that, versus the 4-lane road by my house, paving it so it can sustain, hundreds of thousands of cars a day. It's a little bit different engineering exercise.
And weights of trucks going up to like 200-ton rolling loads.
Yep. You can learn a lot.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of at the end of our show, Matt, but I appreciate you coming on and talking to us about your experience with database DevOps and what you do. This is it was really great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks. Yeah, it was fun, and it's always good when data and dev talk. Like I said, good things come of that. Always, if we're a little nicer to each other, we're going to make better stuff.
Absolutely.
But we can still pick at each other sometimes. We don't want to lose that entirely. That's no fun.
Kind of like a 2-wheeled racing is better. That kind of picking.
Yeah, definitely not. No. But to each their own.
And if you're getting to know Matt for the first time, check out his his racing. He's got some of that on his website. We'll include SQLatspeed.com in the show notes.
SQLatspeed.com.
Yep.
Yep. And that's all. I'm that everywhere online, except for Instagram. The team is at 5Co Racing. Got to get that plug in for the sponsors this year.
Absolutely. And we'll include all those links in the show notes. So, Matt, thanks so much. And to the dear listeners, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.